I never thought a tree could break my heart. But there I was, standing at the edge of the forest preserve, watching a logger spray paint a bright orange X on the oak we'd planted together 5 years ago. My hands were shaking so badly I had to shove them in my pockets. The tree was marked for removal because of the new highway expansion, and all I could think about was Kai's face the day we'd put that sapling in the ground, how he'd looked at me with dirt on his cheek and said, "This tree would outlive us both." He was wrong. The tree wouldn't even outlive our relationship. Let me back up. I should probably start at the beginning, back when I didn't even know what I was feeling, back when Kai was just my roommate and I was just a guy who thought he had everything figured out. I met Kai during my junior year of college when I desperately needed a roommate after my previous one graduated early. I'd posted on the university housing board, not expecting much, when this guy messaged me. His name was Kai Chen. He was a graduate student in environmental science, and he promised he was quiet, clean, and could pay rent on time. That was literally all I needed to hear. We met at a coffee shop near campus to make sure neither of us was a complete disaster, and I remember thinking he seemed nice enough. He had this calm presence about him, like nothing could really rattle him. Dark hair that fell into his eyes, glasses he kept pushing up his nose, and this slight smile that made you feel like he knew something you didn't. He was attractive, sure, but I didn't let myself think about it beyond that surface observation. I'd had girlfriends throughout college. I was attracted to women. I didn't question it. Kai moved in on a Saturday in September. He didn't have much stuff, mostly books and plants. So many plants. Within a week, our apartment looked like a greenhouse. He had succulents on the windowsills, a fiddle leaf fig in the corner, herbs growing in the kitchen. I'd never lived with someone who cared so much about living things. My previous roommate had killed a cactus. I didn't even know that was possible. The first few weeks were fine. We were polite roommates. We split the chores, stayed out of each other's way, made small talk about classes and weather. I was studying business management, working toward some vague future in corporate something or other, and Kai was doing research on forest restoration. We didn't have much in common, but then one night in October I came home late from the library, stressed about an exam, and found Kai in the kitchen making stir-fry. The whole apartment smelled incredible. He looked up when I walked in and, without saying anything, pulled another plate from the cabinet. That was it. No big conversation, no asking if I was hungry. He just made enough for two, and we ate together at our tiny kitchen table. And he told me about the restoration project he was working on, how they were trying to bring back native species to degraded areas. His whole face lit up when he talked about it. I found myself leaning forward, genuinely interested, asking questions. That became our thing. We started cooking together, eating together, talking about our days. I started noticing things about him, the way he hummed while he cooked, how he always made sure the plants were watered before he left for campus, the concentration on his face when he was reading, his bottom lip caught between his teeth, the way he laughed, quiet and genuine, like he was surprised by his own amusement. I told myself I was just noticing because we lived together, because he was there all the time. You notice things about people you live with, that's normal. But then there was the night in November when everything shifted, at least for me, even though I didn't realize it yet. We'd both had terrible days. I'd bombed a presentation and Kai's research proposal had been torn apart by his advisor. We ended up on the couch with cheap beer and a movie neither of us really watched. We were just venting, talking about how maybe we weren't cut out for this, maybe we should just drop out and become park rangers or something. Kai laughed at that, said he'd probably be a terrible park ranger because he'd want to lecture every visitor about proper trail etiquette. And then he turned to look at me and his expression got serious. He said, "Thank you for being easy to live with, for making this year not completely awful." It was such a simple thing to say, but something about the way he looked at me when he said it made my chest feel tight. I couldn't look away from his eyes. We were sitting close, closer than I'd realized, and for just a second, I wondered what would happen if I leaned in. The thought came out of nowhere and shocked me so badly I stood up abruptly, mumbled something about needing to sleep, and practically fled to my room. I lay in bed that night, heart pounding, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. I'd never thought about a guy like that. Never. I'd had crushes on girls since middle school, had dated women, had been attracted to women. This had to be just some weird moment of confusion. Maybe I was more drunk than I thought. Maybe I was just lonely and he was there and my brain misfired. I didn't let myself examine it any further. I just pushed it down and decided to forget about it. Except I couldn't forget about it, because now I couldn't stop noticing him. The way his hair looked in the morning, all messy from sleep, the way his t-shirts fit across his shoulders, his hands, long-fingered and always gentle with his plants, the sound of his voice, the way he said my name. I started feeling nervous around him, hyper-aware of where he was in our small apartment. If we were both in the kitchen and he reached past me for something, I'd feel the proximity like an electric charge. This wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting worse. I tried to logic my way out of it. I made a list in my head of all the reasons this was just a weird phase. I was stressed about school. I was spending too much time at home. I needed to get out more, meet some girls, remind myself what I was actually attracted to. So I went to a party with some guys from my finance class. There were plenty of attractive women there. I talked to a few, even got a girl's number. She was pretty and funny and clearly interested. I should have been interested back. But all I could think about was whether Kai was still awake, whether he'd made dinner, whether he'd want to hear about my night when I got home. I left the party early and found him reading on the couch. He looked up and smiled at me, asked how it went, and I sat down and told him the truth, that it was boring and I'd rather be home. His smile got wider and he said good, because he'd made too much pasta and needed help eating it. We stayed up until 2 in the morning talking about nothing and everything, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I'd rather be here with him than anywhere else with anyone else. That's when I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I was attracted to my male roommate. I had feelings for him. Real feelings, the kind that made my stomach flip when he walked into a room. This wasn't a phase or confusion. This was real, and I had no idea what to do about it. I started avoiding him. Not obviously, but I took more shifts at my part-time job, stayed late at the library, made plans with other friends. Anything to not be alone with him in the apartment, because I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust that I wouldn't say something or do something that would ruin everything. Kai noticed. Of course he noticed. He asked me a few times if everything was okay, if he'd done something wrong. I lied and said I was just busy with school. He didn't look like he believed me, but he didn't push. This went on for weeks. I was miserable. I missed him, which was insane because we lived together, but I missed the easy friendship we'd had. I missed our dinners and late-night conversations. I missed feeling comfortable around him, and I was scared of what these feelings meant about me, about my identity, about my future. I'd never questioned my sexuality before. I'd always been so sure, and now everything felt uncertain. It was early December when everything came to a head. There was a massive snowstorm, the kind that shuts down the whole city. The university canceled classes, roads were impassable, and everyone was told to stay home. I couldn't avoid Kai anymore. We were snowed in together. I woke up that morning to find him already in the kitchen making coffee, looking out the window at the whiteout conditions. He handed me a mug without a word, and we stood there together watching the snow fall. It was peaceful, quiet. And then he said we should do something fun, that we were stuck here, so we might as well make the best of it. He suggested we build a blanket fort like we were kids. It was such a ridiculous idea that I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. And then we did it. We pulled every blanket and pillow we owned, into the living room and constructed this elaborate fort. We draped sheets over chairs and the couch, made a tunnel entrance, put our laptops inside so we could watch movies. It was completely stupid and absolutely perfect. We spent the entire day in that blanket fort. We watched bad movies and ate popcorn and played cards. The power went out in the afternoon and we lit candles, and in the flickering light, everything felt different, softer, more intimate. We were lying on our stomachs, facing each other, talking about what we wanted to do after graduation. Kai said he wanted to work in conservation, to help restore damaged ecosystems, to make some kind of positive impact. He got so passionate when he talked about it, his eyes bright even in the dim light. And then he asked me what I wanted, really wanted, not what I thought I was supposed to want. No one had ever asked me that before. I didn't have an answer. I realized I'd been following this path because it seemed safe and practical, but I had no idea if it was what I actually wanted. I told him that. I told him I felt lost, and he said that was okay, that being lost was just the first step to finding yourself. The way he looked at me when he said that made my heart race. We were so close in that small space, our faces maybe a foot apart. I could see the candlelight reflected in his eyes. I could count his eyelashes. And I thought about how I'd been lying to him for weeks, hiding from him, and how tired I was of pretending. So I said something I'd been too scared to say. I told him I'd been avoiding him. He said he knew. I asked if he knew why. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said he had some ideas, but he wanted me to tell him. My hands were shaking, my voice was shaking, but I told him. I said I'd been avoiding him because I had feelings for him, feelings I didn't know how to handle, feelings that scared me because I'd never felt this way about a guy before. I told him I understood if that made things weird, if he wanted me to move out, if he needed space. I was rambling, barely breathing, terrified of his response. And then he reached out and put his hand over mine, stopping my nervous fidgeting. He said it didn't make things weird. He said he'd been hoping I felt the same way, because he'd had feelings for me since October, since that night on the couch when I'd almost kissed him, when I'd run away instead. He said he'd been trying to give me space to figure things out, but it had been killing him to watch me pull away. I just stared at him, trying to process what he'd said. He had feelings for me. He'd had feelings for me for months. I asked him if he was sure, which was probably the stupidest question I could have asked. He laughed, soft and gentle, and said he was very sure, and then he asked if he could kiss me. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to change my mind. When his lips touched mine, everything else disappeared. It was gentle and tentative and absolutely perfect. My first kiss with a man. My first kiss with Kai. When we pulled apart, he was smiling and I was smiling, and I felt like I could finally breathe properly for the first time in weeks. We spent the rest of the storm in that blanket fort, talking about everything we'd been too scared to say. I told him about my confusion, about trying to convince myself it was just a phase, about being terrified of what this meant. He listened without judgment and then told me his own story, about knowing he was gay since high school, about coming out to his family in college, about how hard it had been, but also how free he'd felt afterward. He said I didn't need to have everything figured out right now, that sexuality could be fluid and complex, and that was okay. He said the only thing that mattered was how I felt and what I wanted. And what I wanted was him. I was sure of that. We started dating that night, officially, even though we were snowed in and couldn't go anywhere. Not that we wanted to go anywhere. We had everything we needed right there. When the storm finally cleared and the city dug itself out, we emerged from our apartment as a couple. It felt surreal and terrifying and amazing. I wasn't ready to tell anyone else yet. I needed time to process this new part of my identity, to get comfortable with it myself before I shared it with the world. Kai understood. He said we could go at whatever pace I needed. The next few months were the happiest of my life. We kept our relationship private, which was easy since we lived together. To everyone else, we were just roommates. But in our apartment, we were partners. We fell into this comfortable rhythm. We'd cook dinner together, his hand on my back as he moved past me in the kitchen. We'd study together on the couch, my feet in his lap. We'd fall asleep in his bed or mine, wrapped around each other. Every morning I'd wake up and see him next to me and feel this overwhelming sense of rightness. This was what I'd been missing my whole life without even knowing it. Kai was patient with me as I figured out my identity. I started doing research, reading about bisexuality, listening to other people's stories. I joined some online communities where I could ask questions anonymously. Slowly, I started to understand myself better. I was attracted to women, that was real, but I was also attracted to men, or at least to this man, and that was real too. The label didn't matter as much as the feeling. I was in love with Kai. That was the truth that mattered most. In March, Kai got approved for a community restoration project. The city was allocating land in a forest preserve for native tree planting, and Kai's proposal had been selected. He was so excited he could barely contain it. He showed me the plans, talking a mile a minute about species selection and soil composition and long-term sustainability. I loved watching him like this, so passionate and alive. And then he asked if I wanted to help. He said they needed volunteers for the planting day, and it would mean a lot to him if I was there. Of course, I said yes. I would have done anything for him. The planting day was in April, one of those perfect spring days where everything feels possible. There were about 20 volunteers, mostly students from the environmental science program. Kai gave a little speech about the importance of native species and ecosystem restoration, and I stood there feeling absurdly proud of him. Then we got to work. Kai showed me how to dig the hole, how to position the sapling, how to pack the soil back around it. We planted a small oak tree together, our hands bumping as we worked. When we were done, we stood back and looked at it. This tiny tree that was barely 3 feet tall. Kai said that in 50 years it would be massive, providing shade and shelter and food for countless animals. He said this tree would be here long after we were gone, a living legacy. I said it was our tree then, the one we'd planted together. He smiled and said yes, it was ours. That night, back at our apartment, I told him I loved him for the first time. We were lying in bed, and it just came out. I love you. 3 words I'd been feeling for months, but had been too scared to say. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he loved me too, had loved me for a while now. We fell asleep holding each other, and I felt complete in a way I never had before. I started coming out slowly over the next few months, first to my closest friend from high school, then to a few friends from classes. Most people were supportive, some were surprised. A few were awkward about it, but tried their best. My parents were harder. I called them in May and told them I was dating someone. And when my mom asked what her name was, I said his name was Kai. There was a long silence. My dad asked if I was sure if this was really what I wanted. I said yes, I was sure. They said they needed time to process it. That hurt, but Kai reminded me that they'd had years to get used to one version of me, and I was asking them to adjust their understanding. He said to give them time. He was right. By summer, my parents had come around. They asked to meet Kai, and we drove home for a weekend. It was awkward at first, but Kai was so genuinely himself that it was impossible not to like him. By the end of the visit, my mom was hugging him goodbye, and my dad was asking about his research. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. We graduated that spring. I got my business degree, and Kai completed his master's program. We decided to stay in the city, got a new apartment together, a real one that we chose as a couple. Kai got a job with a conservation nonprofit doing exactly what he'd dreamed of doing. I got a job at a marketing firm. Not exactly my passion, but it paid well and I was good at it. We built a life together. We adopted a cat that Kai named Douglas Fir, Doug for short. We hosted dinners for friends. We hiked on weekends. We visited our tree in the forest preserve every few months, watching it grow slowly but steadily. Kai would check its leaves, assess its health, and always declare it was thriving. It became a tradition, our tree visits, a way to mark time. 5 years passed like that. 5 years of building a life together, of growing together like that tree we'd planted. We talked about getting married eventually. We talked about buying a house, maybe adopting kids someday. We had plans, a future we were working toward. I thought we were solid. I thought we were forever. But somewhere along the way, things started to shift. It was subtle at first. Kai was working longer hours, coming home exhausted. His nonprofit was understaffed and overworked, and he was taking on more and more responsibility. He'd come home and collapse on the couch, too tired to talk about his day. I was busy too, climbing the ladder at my firm, taking on bigger clients. We started having dinner separately, eating quickly before going back to our laptops. We stopped hiking on weekends because we were both too tired. We stopped visiting our tree. We were living in the same apartment but existing in parallel, not together. I didn't notice how bad it had gotten until it was too late. Or maybe I noticed but didn't want to admit it. It's easy to tell yourself you're just in a busy phase, that things will get better when work calms down, that this is just what adult relationships look like. But the truth was we were drifting apart. We were becoming roommates again instead of partners. The conversation happened on a random Tuesday in October. I came home from work to find Kai sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, which was unusual because he rarely drank on weeknights. He looked tired, but more than that, he looked sad. He asked if we could talk, and my stomach dropped because I knew what was coming. You always know. He said he loved me, that he would always love me, but he didn't think we were working anymore. He said we'd both gotten so caught up in our careers and our individual lives that we'd forgotten to prioritize us. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to fix it, but he didn't think we could. Not without one or both of us making major changes we weren't ready to make. He said maybe we'd grown in different directions and that was okay, that was allowed, but it meant we needed to let each other go. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say we could fix it, we could try harder, we could go to therapy or take a vacation or do something. But the truth was he was right. We had grown apart. We'd let work and stress and exhaustion erode what we'd built. And I didn't know how to fix it either. So I said, okay. We sat there at the kitchen table, both of us crying, and we said, okay, this was over. 5 years, and it was over. Kai moved out 2 weeks later. He took his plants, his books, half our stuff. He left Doug with me because I was the one who was home more. The apartment felt hollow without him. I'd walk past his empty room and feel like I'd lost a limb. I missed him constantly. I missed the sound of his voice, the way he hummed while cooking, the way he'd push his glasses up his nose when he was concentrating. I missed us. I threw myself into work because it was easier than sitting in that empty apartment. I took on more clients, worked longer hours, said yes to every project. My boss was thrilled. I was miserable. But at least I was too busy to think about Kai, about what we'd lost, about how I'd let the best thing in my life slip away. Then last week, I saw the article. It was in the local news section, just a small piece about the highway expansion project. They were taking a section of the forest preserve to build a new interchange. I felt sick reading it because I knew our tree was in that section. I drove out there the next day, had to see for myself, and that's when I saw the logger marking trees with orange spray paint. I watched him move from tree to tree, marking the ones that would be cut down. And then he stopped at ours. Our oak tree, the one Kai and I had planted together, the one that was supposed to outlive us both. The logger sprayed a bright orange X on the trunk and moved on. I stood there staring at that X for I don't know how long. This tree was supposed to be our legacy, proof that we'd existed together, that what we had mattered, and now it was going to be cut down for a highway, like it had never been there at all, like we'd never been there at all. I felt the grief I'd been holding back for months crash over me. I sat down right there on the ground and cried, for the tree, for Kai, for us, for everything we'd lost. I pulled out my phone and I called him. I hadn't talked to him since he moved out. We'd texted a few times about logistics, about splitting bills and mail, but we hadn't actually spoken. He answered on the third ring, said my name like a question. I told him about the tree. I told him they were cutting it down. There was a long silence, and then I heard him take a shaky breath. He asked where I was, and I told him I was at the preserve, sitting by the tree. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. He showed up in 18. He walked through the trees and found me still sitting on the ground. And without saying anything, he sat down next to me. We looked at our tree together, at the orange X, marking it for death. And then Kai started talking. He said he'd been thinking about us a lot, about how we'd let everything fall apart. He said he missed me. He said breaking up was the right thing to do at the time because we weren't healthy. We weren't making each other happy anymore. But that didn't mean he'd stopped loving me. He said he didn't think he'd ever stop loving me. I told him I felt the same way. I said I'd been so focused on work because I didn't know how else to cope with losing him. I said I missed him every single day. We talked for hours, sitting there by our tree. We talked about what went wrong, about how we'd both prioritized everything else over our relationship. We talked about whether we could try again, whether we could do it better this time. Kai said he'd left his job. He said it was destroying him, the long hours and the burnout, and he'd realized it wasn't worth it. He'd taken a position at a smaller organization, better hours, less pay, but actual work-life balance. He said he'd been thinking about reaching out to me, but he didn't know if I'd want to hear from him. I told him I'd been wanting to reach out too, but I was scared. Scared he'd moved on, scared I'd ruined everything, scared I'd lost my chance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Kai stood up and walked over to the oak tree, putting his hand on the trunk, right over the orange X. He said it wasn't fair that this tree was being cut down, that it had done everything right, grown strong and healthy, and it was being destroyed for something completely beyond its control. I stood up and put my hand on the tree next to his. I said maybe we could save it. Kai looked at me and said how. I didn't have an answer. We couldn't stop a highway expansion. We were just two people. But then Kai got this look on his face, the one he got when he was solving a problem. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. He called his contacts at the conservation nonprofit, at the city planning office, at the environmental advocacy groups. He explained the situation, asked about transplanting mature trees, about rerouting plans, about environmental impact studies. I listened to him fight for this tree, for our tree, with the same passion he'd had when we first planted it. And I remembered why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place, his dedication, his refusal to give up on things that mattered. After an hour of calls, he finally hung up and turned to me. He said there was a chance, a small one, if they could prove the tree was healthy and viable for transplanting, and if they could find a suitable location, and if they could get the funding, they might be able to move it instead of cutting it down. It was a long shot, but it was possible. I asked what we needed to do. He smiled and said we needed to fight for it, so that's what we did. Over the next 2 weeks, Kai and I worked together to save our tree. We filed petitions, gathered signatures, contacted local news stations, raised money for the transplanting costs. We spent every evening together working side by side like we used to, except this time we were working towards something that mattered to both of us. We were a team again. And somewhere in the middle of saving this tree, we saved us too. We started talking about everything we hadn't talked about before, about boundaries and priorities and how to maintain a relationship while still pursuing our individual goals, about the importance of making time for each other, of not letting work consume everything, about communication and honesty and asking for what we need. We talked about trying again, doing it right this time. Kai said he wanted to, but only if we both committed to putting us first. I said yes. I said I'd learned my lesson. I wasn't going to lose him again. Yesterday, we got the news. The city approved the tree transplant. They found a location deeper in the preserve, away from the highway expansion, where our oak tree could continue to grow. The transplant is scheduled for next month. It's going to be a huge undertaking, moving a mature tree, but Kai says it has a good chance of survival. Trees are resilient. They can adapt to new conditions, grow new roots, thrive in new locations. He said it with this meaningful look, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the tree anymore. This morning, I woke up in Kai's apartment. I'd stayed over after we'd spent the evening celebrating the transplant approval. I woke up to find him already awake, propped up on one elbow, looking at me. He said good morning, and I said good morning back, and it felt like coming home. He asked if I wanted to move back in with him, or if he should move back in with me, or if we should find a new place together, a fresh start. I said a fresh start sounded perfect. He smiled and kissed me, and I felt that same rightness I'd felt 5 years ago when we first got together. This was where I belonged, with him. We're going to be there for the tree transplant next month. We're going to watch them carefully dig up our oak tree, roots and all, and move it to its new home. We're going to help it settle in, make sure it has everything it needs to survive. And then we're going to watch it grow, together this time. We're going to visit it regularly, mark the seasons by its changes. We're going to build our life around it, around us, around the things that matter. The logger marked our tree for death, but we fought for it, we saved it, and in the process, we saved ourselves. That tree is going to outlive us both, after all, just like Kai said it would. It's going to stand there for decades, growing stronger every year, a living reminder that some things are worth fighting for, that love is worth fighting for, that we are worth fighting for. I never thought a tree could break my heart, but I also never thought a tree could heal it. Life is strange that way. The things that matter most aren't always the things we expect. Sometimes they're the quiet moments, the small gestures, the seeds we plant together. Sometimes they're the willingness to fight for something, to refuse to give up, to believe that growth is always possible. Sometimes they're just a tree in a forest preserve, marked with an orange X, waiting for someone to say, no, not this one. This one matters, this one lives. Kai matters, we matter, and I'm not letting go again.